Like the video, subscribe, and comment your country below so I know who's listening tonight. Turn off the lights and put on headphones for the full horror experience. Let's begin the nightmare. If you're brave enough. Everyone in the dying town of Coleridge used to say Halloween meant nothing anymore, that the old tales of witches and ghosts and restless spirits had faded with the coal dust that once choked every street. But the teenagers who still roamed these cracked sidewalks carried the stories in their blood like a silent infection passed down from tired parents who swore never to talk about the night of fire, the night of screams, the night the sirens never came, because acknowledging that horror meant acknowledging that something still watched them, hungering, waiting for the one night every year when life and death blurred into thin, rotten fabric, and even though no one admitted it aloud, the entire town felt a prickling unease as October crept toward the 31st, with its swollen moon, its blackened sky, its chiming wind that shook the rusted chains of abandoned mines and rattled forgotten bones beneath the soil. 3 teens, Ethan, a quiet kid with too many nightmares, Marla, sarcastic but frightened of being alone, and Jax, a reckless boy with a dangerous curiosity, planned to do what no one had dared for 20 years. Break into the old Braylock orphanage, a twisted brick corpse on the hill that locals avoided even in daylight, its windows shattered, its playground melted from a fire no one could explain, its basement sealed with thick steel plates no one had dared to cut open, because rumor said the children who died there didn't burn, didn't suffocate, didn't stop screaming until the walls absorbed their voices, and even now, if you pressed your ear to the bricks on a windless night, you could hear them whispering names, begging to be let out. The trio didn't believe half that crap. Well, Ethan did, but he didn't say so. So when they walked the dusty path under dead trees, carrying flashlights, bolt cutters, and the delicious arrogance of youth, Coleridge held its breath, streetlights flickered, dogs refused to bark, and the sky dimmed as though something enormous moved behind the clouds, watching, intrigued. They reached the orphanage gates, tall bent iron bars carved with scratched graffiti warnings like, "Don't open the door and he still hunts," and Jax, always laughing, snapped the chain easily, not noticing that the moment metal struck ground, the wind stopped like a throat closing, and all sound drained from the world except their feet crunching dead leaves, the 3 pushing inward into a courtyard littered with broken toys, scorched rocking horses, and a seesaw frozen with black stains that weren't rust. They joked to hide their fear, but Ethan noticed movement in the shadows, ragged shapes darting low, disappearing before he could focus, and when Marla asked if he was okay, he lied, because he didn't want to sound like the same scared kid who woke from nightmares screaming about faceless children banging on his window, dragging nails across the glass, whispering his name as though they knew him from another life. The door to the orphanage sagged crookedly, wood black and soft like something rotten, and when Jax shoved it open, the smell hit them like a physical blow. Burnt sugar, wet ash, and something coppery, something that reminded Ethan of blood, though he tried not to think it, and inside, their flashlights carved narrow tunnels through a darkness so thick it felt alive, thick with dust, dangling cobwebs, and coat hooks draped with tiny, charred jackets that looked like they still held the shape of bodies. The lobby was littered with children's shoes, small, melted, curled like shriveled fruit, and a large, faded mural depicting smiling kids in Halloween costumes was smeared with soot except for their eyes, which remained bright blue, detailed, disturbingly realistic, watching the intruders with hungry fascination. The further they walked, the more Ethan felt a pressure behind his eyes, a subtle ringing, like someone whispering too quietly to understand, and he kept spinning around, convinced he was being followed, but the hall behind them remained empty except for dust drifting like ashes from some unseen fire. They explored classrooms with overturned desks, burned artwork, chalkboards etched with nails instead of chalk, the scratches forming crooked letters that suggested a message but always broke into incoherence, as though written by shaking hands at the moment of death. Marla tried to joke that ghosts with bad penmanship weren't scary, but her voice trembled, and Ethan saw goosebumps across her arms, the temperature dropping the deeper they walked. Somewhere above them, something heavy dragged across a floor, slow, uneven, like a limp body scraping, and Jax, faking bravery, laughed that it was just raccoons until a loud crash echoed, followed by a burst of childlike laughter that didn't sound animal or human, laughter that repeated like a broken recording, the same pitch, same rhythm, over and over, until it cut off mid-giggle. They should have left then. But curiosity and fear created a dangerous inertia, pushing them onward into a cafeteria where rows of tiny metal tables lay overturned like tombstones, and a massive burned symbol covered the far wall, scorched into brick, depicting a circle of children holding hands around a horn shape that resembled both human and beast, their faces twisted into wide-open mouths, screaming or laughing, impossible to tell. On the floor beneath it, dozens of miniature masks were scattered, simple paper. Halloween masks, witches and pumpkins and clowns, but each one had 2 holes burned through, like eyes melted out. Jax picked one up, joking about vintage horror merch, when a sudden snap echoed behind him, like bones cracking, and something tall crawled quickly behind the serving counter, limbs too long, elbows bending backward, a flicker of pale limbs retreating into darkness, and Ethan's heart seized because he knew that movement, knew it from his dreams, the thing scratching at his window, the thing that whispered soon. They fled, stumbling down hallways that seemed to stretch impossibly long, as if the building rearranged itself, trapping them in a labyrinth of rotting wood and shifting walls, plaster falling like ash, doors leading into identical rooms filled with children's beds, sheets blackened, some still indented with sleeping shapes, like burned bodies had never been removed. Ethan's flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment he saw dozens of children standing in the room, backs turned, heads tilted in unnatural angles, unmoving like mannequins, and when the light blinked again, they were gone. Panic escalated, but they reached a set of double doors marked basement, padlocked with chains that looked recent, as though someone sealed it after the fire, not before. Jax insisted on breaking it open because that's where the real story is, and before Ethan could stop him, metal snapped, echoes rolling through the building like thunder, and the doors swung open on their own, releasing a gust of freezing air smelling of dirt and tears. They descended stale concrete steps into a cavernous chamber lit only by their flashlights, walls covered in hundreds of child-sized handprints pressed into soot, smeared downward like they had been dragged, and on the floor sat a massive pile of burned dolls, melted into grotesque shapes, limbs fused together, faces erased, except for one at the top. Porcelain, perfect, wearing a bright clown costume, untouched by fire, smiling too wide, eyes glossy and wet like real eyes. And Ethan, trembling, whispered that someone must have placed it there recently, because no fire could spare something so delicate. As they approached, a sound rose. Not a scream, not a whisper, but a chorus of tiny breaths, inhaling in unison, as though 100 invisible mouths exhaled dust from the walls, and then the pile of dolls shifted slightly, like something beneath them moved. Panic surged, but it was too late. The porcelain clown's head rotated with a slow, grinding crack, its smile stretching beyond human anatomy, and the burned pile erupted with dozens of skeletal, child-sized shapes clawing upward, empty eye sockets glowing with ash-colored fire, shrieking in voices that overlapped into a single tortured cry. "Stay!" Ethan and Marla bolted, Jax falling behind, dragged by something unseen, screaming that something had his leg, and when Ethan turned the flashlight toward him, he saw pale childlike hands gripping Jax's ankle, dozens more piling over him, dragging him toward a dark pit carved into the floor, a pit that pulsed with heat like a furnace. Jax begged, clawing the ground, nails ripping bloody, but the creatures were relentless, and Ethan, shaking, grabbed his friend's arm, but something deeper pulled harder, something ancient, something with intent, and Jax screamed a final agonizing plea. "Don't let them!" Before he was yanked downward into the blackness, vanishing, voice cut short, no echo, no last breath. Ethan and Marla fled blindly, climbing stairs that felt endless, chased by soft, pattering footsteps like children running on bare feet, giggling, calling names they shouldn't know, voices overlapping, whispering promises, threats, lullabies, until they burst through the front door into freezing night air, collapsing on the courtyard as the orphanage loomed behind them, silent, breathless, watching, and Ethan knew, just knew, that Jax wasn't dead. Not exactly, not yet, because the whispers followed them, weaving into the wind. chanting a rhyme older than language, a rhyme that promised the night wasn't over, that Halloween wasn't a holiday, but a harvest, and the children inside weren't ghosts. They were seeds, waiting to bloom under moonlight, and somewhere beneath the earth, in the belly of that cursed orphanage, Jax's voice began to scream again, echoes rising, not with terror, but with laughter, and Ethan understood the worst truth. The thing beneath Coleridge didn't just haunt children, it made them. The police search for Jax began the next morning, though no one called it a search at first, because everyone assumed he'd just run away. Another restless Coleridge kid escaping before adulthood trapped him like a rusted bear trap, but Ethan and Marla knew the truth and didn't know how to say it without sounding insane, so they sat on their front steps while cops wandered around pretending to care, asking neighbors if they'd seen a boy with a leather jacket, a crooked smile, and a bruise on his knuckle from punching walls when he was angry, and the whole town sighed with tired familiarity because Coleridge had a habit of swallowing kids, and adults had a habit of pretending not to notice until the kid never came back, then holding a sad vigil with candles nobody felt anything for. Ethan tried to tell Officer Baines about the orphanage, about the screams, the basement, the thing that dragged Jax away, but Baines just stared with that empty stare cops swear when they've already decided what version of truth they will allow to exist, and he placed a heavy hand on Ethan's shoulder and said, "Son, don't make stories, it only hurts the parents more," as if parents ever wanted the truth anyway, as if parents would rather believe their child died quietly in a ditch than accept something impossible stole them. The investigation quickly turned into routine, missing posters taped to telephone poles, police cars parked for show, a few classmates pretending to cry on social media, then moving on to Halloween parties and pumpkin selfies, because tragedy is only interesting if it doesn't ruin your weekend. Yet beneath that surface, a strange ripple began. 2 younger kids vanished the same night, brothers who lived near the old train tracks, and their mother swore she heard giggling outside her window at 3 a.m., giggling that wasn't her boys, followed by the sound of something tapping the glass with nails. Then silence so suffocating she couldn't move, couldn't scream, until morning when she found their beds empty, sheets cold, shoes sitting perfectly by the door as if they left calmly, obediently, following something they trusted. Police blamed runaway behavior again, but the mother insisted her sons feared the dark, they wouldn't walk outside alone, especially barefoot, especially on Halloween night. But the adults of Coleridge were experts at burying the truth beneath simpler narratives, because this town suffered from a disease older than memory. Denial as survival, and Ethan realized that every missing child over the past 20 years fit the same pattern. Taken on Halloween or near it, bodies never found, investigations dissolved into silence, parents left with unanswered questions that festered into dull-eyed numbness. Ethan researched old newspaper archives at the abandoned library, dusty records no one had digitized, and he discovered that Braylock Orphanage didn't burn in one tragic accident like everyone said, but in a string of fires that occurred 2 years in a row, both on Halloween, both after behavioral incidents, vague wording hinting at rituals, not accidents, and the article mentioned something bizarre. Every child had drawn the same symbol weeks before the fire, a crude shape with curved horns, smiling eyes, and long arms stretched outward, as though welcoming something into the world. Ethan's nightmares worsened. Shadowy children standing at the foot of his bed, heads tilted, whispering in broken voices, asking him questions he couldn't understand, and always behind them, a taller figure with limbs like cables, its face a blank white mask smeared with soot, its voice layered with many voices as it said, "Bring them back," and each morning Ethan woke screaming, sheets soaked, feeling as though invisible hands had been gripping his ankles. Marla also changed, quieter, paranoid, refusing to go anywhere after sunset, constantly checking behind her, claiming she heard laughter under her bed at night. A childish giggle that never escalated, just repeated until dawn. She admitted to Ethan that she sometimes smelled burning hair when she was alone, a scent that followed her like an omen, and some nights she thought she saw a small figure crouched in the corner of her room, unmoving, waiting, but when she turned the light on, nothing remained except a trail of ash. Meanwhile, school tried to carry on, normal routines, morning announcements, teachers lecturing about history and math while everyone pretended nothing was wrong. But Coleridge wasn't normal anymore. not even pretending well, because more kids began disappearing in small ways. Skipping class, going silent, staring blankly out windows, whispering among themselves as though sharing secrets with someone no one could see, and Ethan noticed a group of younger kids drawing the same symbol from the orphanage on notebooks and desks, the horned figure with wide open arms, and when he asked one girl where she had seen it, she replied in a soft, monotone voice, "We learned it last night," before blinking as if waking from sleep and denying she said anything. The teachers didn't intervene, because they were afraid, though they never said it, eyes sunken with sleeplessness, bodies tense, voices brittle, as if the adults sensed something stalking the children, something that wanted them, something that Coleridge had always sacrificed without resistance. A rumor spread that Jax was seen standing in the woods at night, pale, grinning, eyes glowing faint orange like embers. But when someone called his name, he vanished between trees, leaving behind the sound of small footsteps running in circles, giggling, and Ethan refused to believe that rumor until he dreamed of Jax emerging from darkness, face cracked like burned porcelain, mouth filled with too many teeth, whispering, "It doesn't hurt down here anymore, come see," and reaching out with a child's hand instead of his own. Haunted by fear and guilt, Ethan finally told his parents everything. The orphanage, the basement, the fire-made children, the thing that took Jax, but they stared at him with hollowed expressions, exchanging a silent, fearful glance, and his mother spoke first, voice trembling as she whispered, "Don't ever speak of that place again," while his father locked all the windows, turning on every light in the house, as if preparing for an invasion, and Ethan realized for the first time that his parents weren't skeptical. They were terrified, because they knew, they always knew, and they had chosen silence as survival. That night, someone or something walked through Coleridge, unseen but felt, leaving footprints of ash on sidewalks, setting off motion lights, causing dogs to whimper and hide beneath porches, and in the morning, a final horror surfaced. More children missing, 6 this time, all under age 12, beds left perfectly made, windows unbroken, and every family reported the same sound last night. Childlike laughter echoing in the hallway, followed by the feeling of many small hands touching their feet through the blankets, and when the police asked why no one screamed, no one fought back, every parent said the same haunting answer, "I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe, something told me to stay still," and Coleridge understood, in the deepest marrow of its bones, that whatever haunted Braylock was awake again, hungry again, and this year, Halloween wasn't waiting for nightfall, it had already begun harvesting. The night after the 6 children vanished, Coleridge tried to convince itself that life could continue, that Halloween decorations and fake plastic skeletons could camouflage the rot boiling beneath the surface, but the town wasn't just frightened anymore, it was exposed, stripped of the lie that everything was random, and the few who were left, those not taken, not possessed, not sleepwalking into the forest, began clinging to one another in desperate clusters, whispering rumors that turned into confessions that turned into revelations, and Ethan discovered that Coleridge had survivors of Braylock Orphanage still living within its broken streets, old men and women who had been children during the fires, who had blocked the memories for decades, and only now, with children disappearing again, did their minds begin cracking open like fragile shells. Ethan met one of them, Mrs. Hollister, a frail woman with milky eyes who lived in a sagging house near the train tracks, and when he asked about Braylock, she didn't pretend ignorance, she didn't tell him to leave, she simply whispered, "We were told not to speak of it, or it would hear us," and when Ethan begged her to explain, she spoke of nights when the orphanage children were lined up in the basement and forced to sing songs they didn't understand, songs with no language, only sounds that vibrated their bones, and the adults watching them wore masks, white porcelain masks, to hide their fear, because whatever they summoned demanded obedience from both child and caretaker, and Mrs. Hollister swore that during one ritual, the children began changing, their eyes glowing, voices doubling, skin turning gray, and they all reached toward something rising from the shadows, something tall, shapeless, with the scent of burning leaves and wet soil, and she heard it whisper inside her skull, "We are born from broken things, we return for broken things." And then one night the fire began. Not an accident, but a purge, parents and town officials burning the building to stop another summoning. Except they didn't save the children. They sealed them inside, and every adult heard their screams melt into laughter as the flames grew, and afterwards, the town made a vow of silence, a vow passed from generation to generation. Ignore it, and it will go away. But it never left, it only waited until Coleridge filled with children again. Meanwhile, survivors among the teens formed a secret group, meeting after midnight in the abandoned skating rink, comparing notes on nightmares and sightings, and Ethan learned that many of them had seen the children of Braylock wandering the streets. Small figures with no faces, fingers too long, heads tilted, watching, choosing. And one kid named Jonah admitted he'd been followed home by a little girl in a burnt nightgown who kept pointing at his house and whispering, "One more room," before disappearing into smoke. And another kid, Lacey, said she woke up in the woods with her feet covered in ash, surrounded by children sleeping in a circle, hands joined, humming the same tuneless song from the orphanage, and when she tried to wake them, their mouths opened in unison and gas poured out, choking her until she passed out again. The group decided they would solve the mystery themselves, because the adults were useless, either terrified, numb, or pretending nothing was happening. But every attempt they made was met by forces they didn't understand. Electronics died, vehicles stalled, compasses spun wildly, and paths in the woods shifted like living mazes, guiding them deeper, never back, and Ethan realized Coleridge wasn't just haunted, it was alive, reshaping itself to feed an ancient hunger. Then came Marcus, the conspiracy junkie, who revealed that Coleridge wasn't on any official maps until 1951, the same year Braylock opened, and digging deeper, Ethan uncovered documents showing the orphanage wasn't built to shelter children. It was built to collect them, to gather broken, unwanted, emotionally fractured youth. Because children who lived in fear were more susceptible to the gaze, more willing to surrender themselves to a promise of belonging, and Braylock offered that promise through The Hollow Guest, a name scribbled in a survivor's notebook, a crude drawing of a horned figure with empty eyes, always smiling, always open-armed, as if offering mercy. But the darkest truth came when Ethan discovered that not all the missing children were taken forcefully. Some went willingly, lured by promises whispered into their dreams. "Come, and you'll never be alone again." And parents admitted that their children had been acting strange days before disappearing, staring at walls, laughing at nothing, leaving their toys arranged in perfect circles, saying things like, "He's coming to fix me." And Ethan realized the entity didn't steal children. It adopted them, molding them into its offspring, loyal, obedient, void of pain. And that Braylock wasn't a tragedy. It was a nursery, a breeding ground, and the fire didn't stop it, it only scattered its children, who now wandered Coleridge like hunters, returning on Halloween to reclaim what belonged to them. Yet, even as fear swallowed the town, Ethan discovered a thread of hope. Someone had survived Braylock without being taken, a child who escaped through the basement during the fire, now grown, living under a false name, hiding knowledge that could stop the ritual permanently. But reaching this person required crossing the woods, the place most avoided, because the woods were no longer trees and soil. They were corridors of childhood nightmares, bending space, hiding footsteps, whispering lies, and survivors who entered often returned transformed, mute, pale, smiling too widely, eyes reflecting fire they never saw. Still, Ethan and the others decided they had no choice. Either learn the truth or become part of the harvest. And they prepared to enter the woods on the night before Halloween, armed with flashlights, knives, and desperate courage. But as they reached the tree line, they heard children singing that wordless song, distant yet everywhere, the sound of laughter echoing between trunks, and Ethan realized the cruelest truth of all. The missing children were not lost. They were waiting, calling, guiding. And Coleridge wasn't a town being hunted. It was a town being reclaimed by the children it had sacrificed. When the night of Halloween finally arrived, Coleridge no longer wore costumes or smiles, because everyone sensed something ancient stretching awake beneath the town, something that remembered the smell of burning flesh and the sound of children screaming. And as Ethan, Lacey, Jonah, Marcus, and the remaining survivors prepared to enter the woods to search for the last living survivor of Braylock Orphanage, the town itself seemed to withdraw. Lights flickering, shadows lengthening, houses groaning like they were holding their breath, and parents stood behind windows watching teenagers march toward a fate they couldn't stop, too afraid to help, too ashamed to admit that the kids had been abandoned once before and were being abandoned again. But Ethan wasn't motivated by heroics. He felt responsible, because he now understood that Coleridge existed to feed an old promise: broken children offered to a broken God. And the only way to end it was to confront the source. So the group stepped into the forest, knowing they wouldn't all return, and the trees immediately swallowed their flashlights, bending the beams downward, as if refusing to illuminate the path, and the ground grew soft, wet, pulsing like heart tissue under their boots, and sounds moved in circles around them. Running feet, giggles, whispers, always behind them, never beside or ahead, like something was hurting them deeper, and Marcus, the skeptic turned believer, muttered that this place wasn't a forest anymore, it was a threshold, a living mouth waiting to be fed, and he wasn't wrong, because within minutes the trees changed shape, forming natural archways with sagging branches that looked like arms, and distant bonfire light flickered through the leaves, accompanied by a smell of roasted sugar and burnt hair, and Jonah swore he saw a little boy standing at the edge of the clearing, eyes black, cheeks melted like wax, holding a stuffed rabbit that dripped with ash, and when Ethan blinked, the child was gone, leaving only tiny footprints pointing toward an old cabin. This was the place the files had mentioned, the rumored hideout of the last surviving Braylock child, now an adult known only as the one who ran. And the cabin was nothing more than a slanted shack with rusted nails and rotting boards, but its windows burned with candlelight and the silhouette of a lone figure moved inside. So Ethan pushed open the door, expecting a monster, but instead found a thin, gray-haired man, hunched in a chair, staring at a wall covered in carvings, hundreds of strange shapes arranged in circles, spirals, spiraling circles, like symbols of a hidden tongue. And when Ethan asked if he was the survivor, the man didn't turn. He simply whispered, "I escaped the fire, but I never escaped the song." And he explained that Braylock didn't just worship the hollow guest, they cultivated it, fed it with emotional ruin. Because sadness was currency and fear was fuel, and they chose orphans. Because no one would miss them. But years later, when the town grew prosperous, it forgot its pact, ignored the lingering hunger, and so the children returned. Not for revenge, but for collection, because their master wanted what was owed, and every Halloween was a contract renewal, a harvest. Ethan begged for a solution, something to break the cycle, but the man laughed without joy, saying the guest was eternal, older than language, older than human skin, and it could only be weakened by taking away what it desired, the children alive, unclaimed, and that meant something horrifying. They needed to rescue the missing kids before the ritual completed at midnight, but to do that they had to cross the clearing, where the children of Braylock gathered in ash-covered circles, performing the song that binds souls together, and the survivor warned them they would see illusions, memories, temptations, visions of lost loved ones, dead siblings, abusive parents offering forgiveness. But they must not answer, must not talk, must not follow, because acknowledging the entity gave it permission to enter, and Ethan swore they would resist, but the survivor shook his head, saying, "It knows your holes and it fills them," before grabbing Ethan's wrist and carving a small symbol into his skin with a rusted blade, a symbol to mask your yearning, because yearning was the key that opened the door. Armed with this grim knowledge, the group left the cabin and entered the clearing where fires blazed high, yet gave no warmth, and children stood in circles, hands clasped, faces covered by white porcelain masks cracked by heat, their bodies swaying in rhythm to a tune that sounded like a lullaby played backward. And when they turned toward Ethan and friends, dozens of heads snapped simultaneously, unnatural, mechanical, revealing eyes like glowing embers simmering in empty sockets, and the children began whispering, not individually, but as one unified voice, "You left us, you burned us, we waited, we waited, we waited," and the words weren't spoken aloud. They vibrated inside skulls, bypassing ears entirely, and Jonah collapsed screaming, clutching his head, begging for forgiveness from no one, from everyone, and the children extended their arms, fingers elongated, nails black with soot, motioning the group to step inside the circle, and for a terrifying moment, Lacey moved forward, hypnotized, tears streaming down her face, whispering, "I miss you, Dad," because Illusion had found her weakness, showing her dead father standing beyond the fire, smiling, arms outstretched. But Ethan grabbed her, shouting that it wasn't real, yet his voice came out strangled, because the entity didn't use ordinary fear. It used love twisted into a weapon. The masked children began chanting faster as smoke spirals rose from their mouths, coiling into a larger shape, one that towered above the flames, humanoid yet collapsed inward, its limbs impossibly long, neck cracked sideways, head covered by a mask with no eyes and a smile carved too wide, and the hollow guest emerged fully, surrounded by whimpering children who clung to its legs like worshipping disciples, and it spoke, not with sound but with sensation, projecting a feeling into their bodies, hunger mixed with tenderness, like a parent longing to reclaim abandoned offspring. And Ethan realized the entity wasn't evil in the usual sense, it was parasitic compassion, devouring everything broken inside a child until the child became hollow enough to accept it, and he felt it probing him, searching his mind for grief, loss, insecurity, and it found something. The night his baby sister died, the guilt he carried, and suddenly she stood before him, barefoot in the ash, wearing the pajamas she died in, smiling with the innocence he never saw in death, whispering his name, "Ethan, it's okay now." And he nearly stepped forward, because in all his nightmares, she never spoke those words. But then the survivor's symbol on his wrist burned like a hot coal, severing the illusion long enough for Ethan to remember the truth, that his sister didn't die in peace, she died alone while he slept, and he screamed, rejecting the vision, breaking the spell. But the hollow guest roared, a soundless quake that rattled bones, and the ground split, revealing a black pit beneath the children, not an abyss, but a nursery, filled with shapes moving, crawling, reaching, waiting, and Ethan understood. The missing kids weren't dead yet, they were being incubated, prepared for transformation, and the ritual was almost complete. In a desperate act, Marcus emptied gasoline onto the ground and lit the clearing, but fire didn't consume the children. It wrapped around them like armor, and they walked through it unharmed, silent, smiling, advancing, while the hollow guest bent its elongated body toward Ethan, lowering its face until the cracked porcelain mask was inches from his, and in the voice of his sister, his mother, his father, it whispered, "Give in, you don't have to hurt any more." But Ethan screamed, "I will not let you take them," and he rushed forward, plunging the survivor's symbol-carved wrist against the mask, causing a violent shimmering reaction, because the symbol didn't kill, it unbound, severing the link between master and child, and the masked children convulsed, collapsing, masks cracking open, revealing human faces beneath, terrified, confused, crying. And the hollow guest shrieked, body dissolving into smoke, stretching upward, escaping into the sky, not vanquished, merely retreated, and the pit began to close, sucking the remaining children upward, spitting them out as if the earth rejected them, leaving dozens of naked, shaking kids sprawled across ash. Ethan and the survivors dragged as many as they could toward the trees as the clearing collapsed behind them, because the forest was dying, folding inward like a collapsing lung, and they barely escaped before the entire grove sank into the ground, leaving only a crater where the ritual once stood. As dawn broke, Coleridge awoke to the sound of sirens and screaming parents reunited with children they thought long dead, but none of the children remembered anything, their eyes empty of recognition, and in the chaos, Ethan stood apart, knowing they had won only temporarily, because the survivor's final words echoed in his head. The hollow guest never leaves, it only waits, because children always suffer, and suffering always calls it home. And when Ethan looked toward the rising sun, he realized Halloween wasn't the night the monster arrived. It was the night the town allowed its nightmares to surface, and though the forest was gone, the emptiness remained, waiting for another generation of broken children to feed it again.